Hello class, this is our first day of graphing sine and cosine. Today we're going to talk about how to graph sine and cosine when we have a change in amplitude and a vertical shift. First, it's important to know what an amplitude is. The amplitude is how tall or the height of the graph. It's also a measure of how far away the graph is from its midline. Which will all make sense in a minute. And we talked yesterday about how sine and cosine graphs are periodic functions. Periodic functions are just functions that repeat themselves over time. So when we refer to a period, we're talking about how long it takes the graph to repeat itself. For your purposes right now, your period is really not going to change very much. But I will ask you to graph multiple periods of a graph. So now let's recall our sine and cosine graphs. Yesterday, we talked about our sine graph, and if you don't have this written down, you might want to write it down again. When we graph our sine graph, there are tons and tons and tons of points on this graph. We really only care about 5 of them. First, it's the point 0, 0, when the angle is 1 and the sine value is 0. The second occurs at pi over 2 and 1. And then we come back to the middle for pi. And then our next one is 3 pi over 2. And we go down to -1. And then we swing back up for 2 pi. Now, that's one period of the function. I could repeat the period, and I could have 2 squiggles of this graph, or I could go backwards over here if I wanted. I just have to make sure to label my axes. So now let's do a cosine graph. So with our cosine graph, again, we still have 1 and -1 as our maximum and minimum values. Cosine starts at the top. Then at pi over 2, it goes down to the middle. And then at pi, it drops all the way down to -1, and then it swings back up. So at 3 pi over 2, we are at 0 again, and then at 2 pi, we are all the way back up here at 1. The graph goes like this. If you were to shift a cosine graph 90 degrees, you would end up being a sine graph, and vice versa. Now, this represents the change in amplitude, this 3 multiplied out front, which basically says instead of my y's values maxing out at 1 or being a minimum at -1, it's going to be 3 and -3. So when you graph this, it's actually very similar to how you graph the normal one. It's very important that you realize that your parent points of this graph occur at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay? It's very, very important that you start to get that in your brain. So this amplitude means that just like when you're shifting a parabola or stretching a parabola or whatever, you're multiplying all your y values by 3. So your maximum of your y value is now going to be 3. Your minimum of your y is going to be -3. And then, if you remember that sine values start in the middle, and go up, down, and back to the middle, then all you have to do is plot your points. You start in the middle. At pi over 2, you're going to end up at 3. At pi, you're going to end up at 0. And then at 3 pi over 2, you're going to be at negative 3. And then at 2 pi, you end up back in the middle. So instead of you're maxing out at 1, you are maxing out at 3. Now, we'll be asked to graph 2 periods of the function. So if you're going to graph 2 periods of this function, you repeat the pattern. So after pi over 2, you would end up with 5 pi over 2. And then it would be 3 pi. And these numbers all occur in sets of 5. So 5 pi over 2, 3 pi, 7 pi over 2, and 4 pi. And the process repeats. So 2 pi and 0 is your new starting point. And then you go up to 3 and back down to the middle, and then down here to the bottom, and then back to the middle. And that would be a second period of the function. And that is a change in amplitude. Or just changing how tall it is. Now, let's do a vertical shift. Now we're going to do a cosine graph. Remember, a cosine graph looks like this. It starts at the top and ends at the top. Keep that in mind. So this time, we have a vertical shift. Now, we know this is on the outside with a vertical shift and not on the inside because there's no parentheses. So this is just telling me that we shift down 4. And I also just like to think of it as your middle line. Usually your middle line, like on the sine graph, is the x-axis. Your middle line, some people like to call it the midline, is going to be at negative 4. So you go down 1, 2, 3, 4. And I like to draw a dotted line. That's my new center. I know that the amplitude of this particular graph is 1. So that means that my maximum of my graph is going to be 1 above 4, and my minimum is going to be 1 below 4. And now I just have to plot my points. Let's label my scale. Always make sure you label your scale. You want to make sure you get in the habit of it because in the future, you're going to have to adjust your scale depending on your shifts. So cosine starts at the top and ends at the top. So we start on the top at 0, this time negative 3. Then we go to the middle. Then we go down to the bottom at the minimum. Then we swing back up. So now we're going to go to the middle again and then back to the maximum. And that would be 1 period of a cosine graph. And again, you can repeat the process. And on your assignment today, it tells you to graph 2 periods. So 5 pi over 2 is the next one. And then 3 pi. And then 7 pi over 2. And then 4 pi. And again, your second period just starts where your first period left off. So you go to the middle, and then down to the bottom, and then back to the middle, and then up to the top. And that would be a second period. And you could graph a third period or a fourth period if you wanted. Let's do one that has a shift and a stretch in the same graph. And it even has a negative. So if a normal cosine graph looks like this, it starts at the top and ends at the top, then a negative cosine graph is going to start at the bottom and end at the bottom. It flips upside down. So go ahead and draw your coordinate plane here. This whole thing first shifts up 1. So your midline is now at 1. This amplitude is at 2. So we're going up 2. This is your new maximum, and this is your new minimum. And again, this negative, instead of cosine starting at the top and ending at the top, it's going to start at the bottom and end at the bottom. Label your scale real fast. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So I start at the bottom. So my bottom number is here. Then I'm going to the middle. Whoops, I messed up just a little bit. My amplitude is 2, so I'm 2 above. So this is at 1, 2, 3, and then 2 below, 0, -1. So this is my minimum value, -1, not -2. My apologies. Now let's graph. We start at the bottom, then we go to the middle, and then to the top, and then back to the middle, and then to the bottom. Then connect your dots. And just for good measure, let's do a negative sign graph. So we have a negative sign. So usually sign starts in the middle and then goes up and then down and then back to the middle. This new sign, this negative sign, is going to do the opposite. It's still going to start at the middle, then it's going to go down first and then up and then back to the middle. This is our negative sign. We're going to go ahead and draw our coordinate plane here. We've got -3. So that tells us that my entire graph is getting shifted down -3, which means my midline is at -3. Now I need to think about my maximums and minimums while I go through and label my scale, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2. And my amplitude here is 1. So that means my maximum is 1 above my center, and my minimum is 1 below my center. And I'm going to start here at 0, 0. But I've got a negative sign because the negative is right over here. So instead of going up to get to positive to pi over 2, I'm going to go down. I'm going to go back to the middle. Then I'm going to go all the way to the maximum, and then I swing back down to the middle. And if I wanted, I could graph multiple periods of this. So your assignment for tonight is to work on the first page of your graphing sine and cosine packet. For the first assignment, it says 4.4 practice day 1. There are only 4 questions on this, so make sure you label your scale, make sure you label your amplitude correctly, make sure that if I were to take that for a test grade, you would totally know, or I would totally know what the heck you're doing. And good luck.